Welcome, everybody, to our second Finger Lakes Forecast webinar. I'm Gay Nicholson. I'm the president of Sustainable Finger Lakes, and I'm really glad that you could join us today as we explore this topic of elevated flood risk here in the Finger Lakes region. I'm joined by our outreach coordinator, Sarah Nickerson, and Ryan Kincaid, our program coordinator. We're offering this webinar series as a place where we can all come together and learn about the forecast for how climate change is going to impact our lives and our regional economy. For our spring series, we're taking a look at our food system, flood risk, and the growing threat of harmful algae blooms in our lakes. And then next fall, we're going to take a look at public health, land use, and renewable energy installations, and the potential for potentially large demographic and economic shifts as climate disruption progresses in the coming decades. Our webinars are going to be at noon on the last Wednesday of the month, but if you can't join us then, you can just register for the webinars and then we'll send you a link to the recording. So today we're going to explore an issue that is of great concern to more and more of us. Upstate New York has been experiencing more frequent storm events and heavier downpours and flooding in the last few decades. And this trend is just going to amplify in the years ahead as climate disruptions increase. You may have also heard that FEMA is updating its floodplain maps to reflect this new reality and that flood insurance rates are going to be going up considerably. So today we're joined by three local experts who are going to speak on the projected flooding patterns, what our options for flood insurance are, what's available to us, and how we can prepare our homes and reduce our flood risk and damage. Scott Doyle worked for Tompkins County Planning and Sustainability Department for 15 years on climate adaptation, conservation, land use, and energy planning. And he's led the work on updating our hazard mitigation plan, and he's going to be sharing an update on the flooding risk and the new FEMA flood maps. Sally Hoyt is the vice president of Tompkins Insurance Agencies, and she's an account executive who's probably written most of the flood insurance in Tompkins County. She's going to be retiring in June, but she's going to be sticking around as a consultant to help them in this growing arena of people needing flood insurance. And then Alan Springett is a retired geologist and engineer with over 50 years of experience in hazard mitigation. He's helped countless communities deal with floods, high wind, earthquakes, wildfires, and he served as the risk assessment lead for FEMA's Region 2, our region. Alan's going to share his advice on what you can do to identify your flood risk and take steps to reduce damage in your home. We're really, really grateful to our panelists for joining us today to share this knowledge that they hold. We're going to go through all three slide presentations first, and then we will hopefully have about 20 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So please be sure to type in your questions. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see the Q&A. Go in there and type in your question. And then at the end, Ryan will be looking through those and directing them to the panelists to respond. So first up is going to be Scott Doyle to talk about our flood risk as climate change continues and how our flood maps are going to be changing and what that means for homeowners. So Scott.
Thanks, Gay. I really appreciate the opportunity and the time here. This is, I applaud Sustainable Finger Lakes for talking about this. Topic is very timely now, and it's something that's really important for all of us to kind of further get our head around and think about not only what we can all do for our own situation, but also things we can do to help each other too. I think it's a really important topic for that. So I want to talk about flood risk across the Finger Lakes in a very brief way to set the stage for discussion with more detail from my co-presenters here. So I'll give you a little better sense of this here on a broad sense based on work we've done, as Gay mentioned, in terms of updating our hazard mitigation plan, but also a sense of where we're at with map updates as well. So there's three main things I want to just walk through with you on this. One, it's a little bit of the history of flooding we've we're experiencing, but also we've had in the Finger Lakes. A bit of a sense of kind of what we might anticipate moving forward with future flood risk, and then a little bit of a lens on the local flood map update process, because I think that's a pretty important one. Then that's going to be specific for Tompkins County, but there's certainly some things in there for others in the region too that are also going through a similar process. So just in terms of history, this is not something that's new for many of us. I think some of our longtime residents in the Finger Lakes, they shot back from the late 30s with the big floods down in Ithaca. This is a front page article of the major flooding on the fairgrounds. Of course, it warranted and advanced a lot of the mitigation measures that in and around the city of Ithaca. This is not new. It's something we talk about in terms of the 1% flood chance, or the thing that used to be discussed is the 100-year flood. We've had a lot of these big events over the last century, in several times over. So it's an important piece to note that fact. This is something that we've experienced in semi-recent history. Well, even more recent history too for some of our Finger Lakes neighbors. This is a shot, of course, from Penyan back in 2014, some post-flood debris, which is something I've gotten to know quite a bit more on some of our county resiliency planning work with how you got to deal with debris post-flood event. But that's something that, of course, for our neighbors up Yates County area, that they're remember that quite well. Lodi Point too. I mean, this is something just from a handful of years ago. Remember how distinct and scary that flood event was up in Lodi Point. And those, talking with different highway superintendents and folks in local government throughout Tompkins County, but also throughout the Finger Lakes region, these are things that are not only throwing things operationally in the loop and in disarray for a period of time, but financially quite a burden as well. When we look back over the last 50 years, some of our mitigation planning work showed that, we've incurred from all different hazard events about $23 million in damages associated with those events. The scary thing is, though, looking forward, if we look at our current flood risk in terms of our 1% annual chance flood maps in Tompkins County, looking forward, that financial risk is approximately over $300 million in terms of losses potential for all different types of residential, commercial, industrial properties that are currently located in floodplains. In Tompkins County, we have about 1,000 of those properties. So that's a scary thing to think about in terms of how we think through our risk picture. Well, and then looking forward to our over the next century, I think many of us pride ourselves on upstate New York and how we are a resilient community, and we are fairly resilient to climate changes. This is one, though, that seems pretty obvious. We're seeing more a higher increase in precipitation events. Looking back over the last since year 2000, we've had steady increases that New York State estimates we're going to have by 2050, increases of up to 10% over what we're used to, and then of course going up above that. So dealing with more water in shorter periods of time is something that we as a region are going to have to continue to get better at. So increased precipitation, that is certainly one of the factors for increased flood risk. Of course, all our communities are changing too, so that's another factor too in terms of how we analyze things. So just briefly to talk about the flood insurance rate maps, which is certainly a capture of risk, and it's very much on people's mind in terms of financial impacts, but also the risk picture. We're having more of a sense of who's at risk here, what properties are at risk. So these flood insurance rate maps, of course, capture the special flood hazard areas, or the areas where every year there's a 1% annual chance of flooding. So FEMA draws these maps and then communities adopt them, but there's obviously some legal and financial consequences to where, if you're located in those areas. This influences kind of how you may take on risk, but also your community might tackle or hopefully avoid that risk as well. So just looking in Tompkins County, this is for all of upstate New York, is in the similar kind of camp. Not completely, because some folks have had recent updates, but our maps are pretty old, from the 1980s. I mean, The old maps don't show us a good picture of risk. They don't reflect the older or the new kind of mapping aspects we have. They're not based on accurate topography. We have much better data than we did 40 years ago. I know I feel quite a bit different than I did in the 80s. I'm sure that the data is as well. Where our communities look different too. Land use has changed quite a bit, and that affects flooding as well. But of course, weather patterns do change as well, and that's certainly an impact that we kind of look and build on that changing history to look at where that risk picture is. So just to talk a little bit about this mapping question, is an important one to know that this is something that the entire country is faced with and is going through this update process. There's a FEMA as a process of modernizing its maps, but also walking through watershed by watershed to update maps as they go. This is something I think they had much higher hopes for, more regular updates, but in the sense of our case, it's been a while and it's a complicated process, so it should take a little while to make sure it's done right. So this is something that is happening around the country, but also throughout upstate New York. I know that our county, Yates County, a few others, Broome County has gone through this recently. It's quite an active process in our region that is complicated and intimidating too. This is just a quick shot map that shows you, I think we've talked a lot about in Greater Ithaca in terms of how maps are changing, and this shows just a quick glimpse of the orange being existing 1% annual chance flood changes, and then flood risk area. The purple being the expanse of that area with this update. So we got quite a few properties in downtown Ithaca that are potentially impacted by this update. Now this is the preliminary maps. The draft maps will be coming up soon. I'll tell you about that process. The other thing to keep in mind too, throughout our region, it's not all increases. We have decreases in some communities as well. So this is just a sense because I thought people would want to know where things are at. This is FEMA has made it clear that, hey, we're just starting kind of this review process. So they've had some internal discussions where you see the star with municipal partners to talk about what these maps may look like. But you see this fall 2022 coming up will be a more public discussion of what the actual maps are going to look like. And then you see what's important to know over the next couple of years is a whole process of better understanding what these are, what they mean, what they don't mean. And they are likely not to take effect till 2024, but it's an important time to start focusing on that and talking about it here. So it's great to talk about that. So the last thing I want to leave you with here before I transition things over to Sally is our region is thankfully thinking about this and kind of how we can get out in front of this flood risk together. One of the things that I've been proud to work on in the wrap up of my time at the Tompkins County Department of Planning and Sustainability is a Resiliency and Recovery Plan that talks about how we can do a better job post-hazard event in terms of recovery. We've worked on a lot of different things with that. I talked about debris earlier, thinking about how we deal with debris post-event, but also what kind of flood resources can we deal with? Like, what would it look like to go through FEMA's community rating system program? Would that work for our communities? Also, are there things from that for a lot of our smaller communities where that would make sense? And what types of things can we do better to deal with flood risk? And also information. What can we do to kind of get information out there that's going to be better for us to individually deal with our properties? And there's things in my own residence and certainly our commercial properties as well. But also then what can we do together to kind of help to reduce our risk of our neighbors, our communities, and our counties as a whole, and of course the Finger Lakes as a whole. I think there's things that we can learn. There's certainly things we've done in this process that I want the region to know about and to utilize and to build from. And I want to do the same, taking and sharing with other folks as well. So I'm going to wrap up there. This is some information, this website here, the climate adaptation page in the Tompkins County Planning Department will give you a better sense of more of those resources. This is my most immediate contact information. I'm happy to talk to you more about that as well. But I'm going to stop sharing and transition things over, and I look forward to talking with all of you a little bit more on this topic at the tail end.
Hi, this is Sally Hoyt. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about flood insurance and special flood hazard areas and how that's going to affect the rating. And if you want to go to the next screen, that'd be great. So everybody knows flood insurance is going to be required if you're on a flood hazard claim, but let's talk about a little bit, where did this come from? Who's the NFIP, et cetera. Let's get a little bit of background before we get into the actual rating. So FEMA was set up the NFIP. Well, FEMA didn't. This was actually corrected, but apparently got missed on the screen. The NFIP was set up by HUD in the late 1960s. Mapping of the country began in the 70s, early 80s, as Scott has talked about. And many areas of the 22,000 communities, as Scott also said, is been mapped with very old maps and have not changed in the last 40 years. So most of the Finger Lakes region has not changed. And we are at a point now where obviously with so much construction that's occurred and so many building developments, et cetera, it's certainly changed where water's running and the topography. Next screen, please. So we first need to tell you with the National Flood Insurance Program, how they define a flood. And I'm going to refer a lot to the National Flood Insurance Program. There are private markets out there that write flood insurance as well. But a lot of them base their information, or at least partially their information, off the NFIP. So I'm going to give you the NFIP as the main standard. Also, there are certain banks that will only accept NFIP policies. They're still not accepting policies from the private markets, including first-time home buyers, FHA loans. Right now, they're only accepting NFIP policies. They're still not accepting anything else. So from the NFIP, their definition is a flood is a general and temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land area, or 2 or more properties, at least one of which is your property. That just means, the ditch going across your neighbor coming into your property and it floods on both of your properties. Don't get too wrapped up into that, other than it's got to be off your property as well as on your property to qualify for a flood, right? It needs to be overflow of inland or tidal waters. A creek is an overflow, a ditch is an overflow if it exceeds its boundaries. Unusual and rapid accumulation or runoff of surface waters from any source. Mud flow or collapse of subsidence of land along the shore of a lake or similar body of water. Next screen, please. I'm sorry, next screen, please.
I'm trying, but for some reason it's not going.
Oh dear.
Let me pause the share and see if I can get it to go. Nope. I'm going to stop the share and see if I can get it on to the next one, and I'll share again. I have no idea.
All the fun stuff with technology.
Yeah. No idea why all of a sudden it would stop working.
There we go. Oh.
This is where we are, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So some things that occurred with FEMA, and I should say the NFIP. The NFIP has changed the rating format. And this is substantial. Since they have been doing flood insurance, it has stayed the same for all these years. They have used the same format. It was a very outdated format, a very inaccurate format, and it was time to make changes. So some of these changes, resulted in realizing that they should be really concentrating on the first floor versus the basements. So a lot of their rating, first floor is now the key component. We used to have preferred risk rates where people that were not in a flood zone, not in a flood hazard zone, the 1%, could buy a much discounted rate. It didn't really make sense a lot of times. And in fact, I believe in Superstorm Sandy, there was over 25% of the structures that were inundated by flood were not in a flood zone. So they've realized that that preferred risk doesn't really make a lot of sense. So it's gone away. They used to subsidize rates, and they're no longer available. And part of that subsidy would be, for example, the preferred risk rates. We will see an annual increase in those old rates, the preferred risk rates, annually until they reach full rate. So they're not just taking somebody that got the preferred risk rates and throwing them into the full rate at this point. They are increasing, and the legal limit is 18% for them to do so, and that's what they're going to do a year. They have also reduced, they had very cumbersome building classes that kind of were difficult to figure out which class they should be in. So they have reduced them to 6 classifications for ease of description. We'll get in that in just a minute. They have changed their rating methodology to provide a more equitable flood insurance rate. And I think that's really the whole gist of this, right? That's what they were doing. That's the whole reason for having all of this change as of October of 2021. They also don't use elevation certificates. They're not required anymore on post-firm construction, and they typically don't require them for any reason. There is a small amount of reason to have it. One would be if you felt you were completely able to be getting out of a floodplain. But I think with the new mapping that they're doing, we're going to see a lot less of the inaccuracies. I've already witnessed that in a couple of things that I've worked on just since October, but I think we will see some further distinguishing marks from that. And you could go to the next screen, please. So first thing that we also need to know is base flood elevation. Although they say they're kind of removing the use of the base flood elevation, it is very much still in the background. So base flood elevation is the elevation of surface water resulting from a flood that has a 1% chance of equaling or exceeding the level in any given year. It is shown on the firm, that's the flood insurance rate map, for zones, and there's a whole lot of zones, I'm not going to read them all off. The base flood elevation is no longer an NFIP rating factor to determine premium. However, the standard flood insurance policy forms still reference the base flood elevation in defining a building's eligibility for the NFIP coverage when partially underground or under construction. Moreover, base flood elevation continues to be a key factor determining compliance with the NFIP floodplain management regulations. And basically what they're trying to say here is they still have to keep it in the circle of things, but it's not used as the meat and potatoes of the rate. They have a lot more going into the rating factors now. Next screen, please.
I don't know why it's doing this. I will stop the share again.
It doesn't like your screens and me talking, I guess.
I don't know why. Let me get to the next one and resume sharing. It likes to only advance 1 or 2 and then it's done.
So one more. Oh, okay. So the rating change that occurred in October was called risk rating 2.0, and that's way too deep into the weeds that we need to go. But what did it change, and how did it change what they are using to rate? So they're now taking into account the distance of a structure from a flooding source, the elevation of the ground where the building is located relative to the flooding source. That kind of gets back into the base flood elevations of the flooding source and the elevation of where your building is. They just have changed the wording of that a bit. Is the structure in a community that's obtaining community rating system discounts? And we'll get into that in a little bit as well. I think Scott alluded to that a little bit when he was speaking as well. So how do they use it? Building occupancy and the type and use of a building indicates which policy form is used. There are 3 separate policy forms, one for the dwellings, homeowners that are 1 to 4 families, one for 5+ units and commercials, commercial buildings. And then there's a separate form for condo associations, which is a whole separate process for them. So what do we do? What do we want? Well, buildings, you want to have replacement cost. They can insure for replacement costs. They can insure buildings and contents coverage. Deductibles, which apply separately to buildings and contents, can also be factors in the rating. And I'll cross my fingers that you can change the screen. Perfect. Okay, so these are the new 6 classifications of buildings and of how they're rated. So it is important that the first floor height is known, and that is where most of the rating occurs. Under the first floor, oftentimes if you apply flood openings, flood vents, you can get discounts, but there are parameters around these, so it's not as easy as it sounds to get these discounts. That means the outside, for example, the outside ground level and the inside level of the space has to be at the same level. So there's now hydrostatic pressure that can push the walls in. So if your crawl space under the building is at ground level and outside is the crawl space is equivalent, then you could put flood vents under that first floor and get discounts. So that's what that really means. If you have your machinery and equipment up above the first floor, or if it is a single story building, if it is above the single story in the attic, you can get discounts. It's 5% discount. Most of us have all of that stuff in the basements, which is why it's more expensive, because you're going to lose it all if your basement floods. Floor of interest, the floor of interest unit being insured is on or maybe higher or less likely to be damaged by flooding, and that is your main floor typically. Statutory discounts. Newly mapped is a discount that you can get for the first year, first 12 months. There's a little bit of parameter with that depending on when your policy starts. As long as the policy starts in the first 12 months after it's been newly mapped in, you get a year's worth at discounted rate. If you are in a pre-flood insurance rate mapping build, you can get a discount of up to 60% if it's your primary home. And the CRS, the community rating system discount, can range from 5 to 45%, depending on the eligibility level of the community, if the community is a participating community in the CRS program. Next screen, please. Here we go.
Yep.
Yay!
Doesn't want to do more than one at a time.
Oh,
I've never experienced that before.
Keeps the discussion fresh and moving.
Yeah. It's just having its own life.
Yep.
It's had its own life for a couple of days.
All right, where's the share?
Okay, so sample FEMA rates. We're talking about all of the Finger Lakes here, right? But I'm using Tompkins County simply because we are getting remapped right now. And because it is rates that I can compare and make sense. So we're going to use Ithaca, City of Ithaca as a sample here. I made some assumptions because I want to show you what's happening with the rates. I made some assumptions that it was a 2-story with a basement, frame construction. Approximately all these buildings will be the same square footage within about 100 square feet. All the mechanicals are in the basement and washer and dryers are in the basement because that's typically what we have, right? I mean, we have older homes. Maximum coverage available for a building, if it is a 1 to 4 unit, is 250,000. So that's what I was rating these on, and we'll hope that we can get to the next screen. Okay, so these rates are run with the new rates, okay, throughout the city. And I did this because I wanted to show how the new rates in the background, they're using information that I don't know where the sources are. They seem to be very quiet about what compiled these sources. So I don't know where they got the information. But Utica Street in the city of Ithaca, a 1,700 square foot building. If we rate it as a owner primary, so they're there plus 50% of the year, owner living in it, okay? Not a rental, not used as a B&B, nothing. The rate with a 2,000 deductible, $2,615 a year. Now that same building, if you, or very similar, if you take it to 2nd Street, still similar replacement cost, etc., the rate is $2,382 a year. Same situation, a little bit different. In Wood Street, it jumps to $4,976 a year. Now, I know, because I've lived here my whole life, that Ithaca floods and a pretty good clip around Wood Street, Plain Street. I've seen flooding down there my whole life. The skateboard park, when I was a kid, I played softball on. That was where we had our little Cinderella softball league. So, you know, I've seen it. I've seen it forever. We've seen it in the Wegmans parking lots, etc. But the difference being here that, it's not that far, right? And from the other locations, and you would think they would be similar. And they used to be similar. So I wanted you to know there's a big difference. Green Street also has same, this one is a little bit higher square footage because I couldn't get an exact match, but it's $4,800, which is less than Wood Street's 1,800 square feet. So when you turn it around and make it a rental, it automatically jumps those. And if you look at them, they kind of all keep running about the same, increasing. But then when you go to a 4-unit, so we're still talking same square footage, we're still talking same replacement cost on the building, but we make it a 4-unit rental. Look how quickly it jumps. And how interestingly that it also evens out in the costs. So all of a sudden the costs are more even as a 4-unit rental than it is in the single unit. Now, part of that, as Alan and I were discussing offline, you've got all your mechanicals still for all 4 units in the basement. So you've got a lot more cost in that basement, right? So yes, there is more potential for taking out the entire use of that building also because of the basement. So yes, there is for sure a reason for this. It's just, I wanted you to see the difference. And if you want to go to the next screen, crossing my fingers, yay. So there are private flood insurance markets, right? So I've given you the FEMA rates, or excuse me, the NFIP rates, but the private markets out there also can write in many of these circumstances. I want to caution that the private markets have different guidelines. They also have different parameters. They might be able to do the full replacement cost of your building. They also might be able to, it may be more, it may be less. We see both. We absolutely see both. In the private markets, for example, we have a company that won't rate a house that was built prior to 1900. That's a problem. A lot of the city of Ithaca was built prior to 1900. They put parameters on that, although it's a private market, we're not going to insure if you're not, if the participating community is not part of the NFIP, because they're using it as their base. Now, in our area here, Enfield currently is not part of the NFIP. I believe, and Scott can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Enfield is going to convert to being part of this in this new process, but they were never part of the NFIP. It gets difficult at times and could become even more difficult as time goes on for any communities that are not in the NFIP to get loans, because the FDIC wants to be sure that those that are in a flood hazard area are obtaining flood insurance. So it is super important that that happen. So that's why private markets can be very good, but they also may have some parameters that you're not expecting. The other thing is that insurance companies now are slowly starting to add, and I'm going to put Dryden Mutual out there because they are probably one of the first that have done this as a small mutual company. They're starting to add endorsements, and those endorsements will cover a limited amount of flood insurance, which I think is fantastic because it's something that we so need. At least sometimes it's just the cleanup, right? It's just the basics that you also need. So they'll put a limit of maybe 10,000 on it, or it might be a percentage of the dwelling, 1%, 2%, whatever it is. So they might put that limit on there, but it is important that companies are starting to recognize that maybe they should put just a little bit of flood insurance on a policy, especially for those that are not in the major flood zones, may not think that they need to have it, but an unusual circumstance happens and it floods their basement. Also, there is a very distinct gap between a property policy and a flood insurance policy. That's kind of call it a donut hole in the middle of it. Flood, again, if you look at the definitions of flood, it's surface water. Okay, it's surface water. A lot of what we get when we get phone calls from customers are your basements have quote unquote flooded, but it's from seepage through the walls. And seepage is excluded on almost every property form out there. It's also excluded, by the way, it's not covered under flood insurance because it's not surface water. So it's important that you can have some of this seepage coverage. And I'm just recently seeing this, where some of the companies and some of the commercial ones will now add up to 50,000. I've now seen that on some commercial policies. And that helps to get, I mean, some of these big boilers and basements, they're like $40,000 easy, right? So it's important to have that coverage available. So companies are starting to get there. It's a very slow process, but I think it's important to know and that flood insurance in general there are other options besides the NFIP. And one of the things, just a quick note with the NFIP, right now, or I should say the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, requires that if a structure is in a flood zone, that the bank get flood insurance in the amount of the loan, or the max that's available of $250,000 if it's a residential building. The problem is that if you are not within 80% of the cost to replace, and if it is not your primary home that you live in 80% of the year, you don't get replacement cost. You're only going to get actual cash value under the NFIP policy. In most of these private markets, you can buy replacement cost on any building, and you may be able to get it to the full limit instead of stopping at 500,000 on a commercial or 250,000 on a residential. So there's a lot of info here. It's very complicated. My best thing to tell you is ask your agent if they have private markets. Ask your agent if you can get insurance other than through the NFIP, and have them run a couple different quotes for you. So I've also had a lot of people ask me if they could, if we could possibly run what if quotes, and what if I would know what the rate will be when they change. Okay, when it changes to a requirement for them. So we've run those quotes for people because the rate isn't going to change. There's no difference now in the rate if you're in a flood hazard zone or not in a flood hazard zone as of October 1st of last year. So your rate is going to be a rate now, will be the same rate unless they increase the rates overall as it would be 2 years from now, 3 years from now, because FEMA has changed their rating base. So we can tell you what that rate should be, and be pretty darn close with it. Okay, I am going to jump off now and let Alan speak so we can get more awesome information that he has.
Okay, now I'm going to have to ask if anyone can see this because I want to share screen, and now I've got the presentation up. Is that visible? That's not sounding good.
No, we can't see it.
Okay, I did a share screen. Share screen. This is what I was concerned about with Zoom. I can do this, okay. Now it seems to be working.
There you go.
That's okay, great.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I had to figure out which way it went on route because I've got Zoom on this, but I'm not using it because of the web based. So thanks everyone. I really appreciate being able to provide some information for you. As as we said earlier, I'm retired from FEMA. I have no interest in pushing FEMA or not pushing FEMA. I loved my work, but that doesn't mean I necessarily love the agency and all of its policies. But there is some really interesting stuff that's out there. The flood risk is real. The photo you see on the front, that was something I took in 1998 up in Black River by Watertown. We had an ice storm that took out about 10,000 poles for Niagara Mohawk across the northern part of the state. But we also had a 1% annual flood on the Black River at the same time. And I'm not sure how well the resolution came out, but that sign in the front says waterfront lots for sale. And you see a house back in the corner. There was another one slightly to the right of that. A few years later, I went back, and guess what? Just about where that sign is another house. They're building them, and the flood at that point was right to the threshold of the doors of the homes that were already built. Deep sigh. You know, there's not a lot you can do if your community is not helping you. And so one of the first things you need to do is understand when you have to speak up. So what I did for this presentation, and it has nothing to do with FEMA, was gave you a quick phrase, RID, R-I-D. Remember that phrase, review flood vulnerabilities. I, inform your family about the requirements, the vulnerabilities, and the mitigation methods so you can determine how to best address those risks and vulnerabilities. And D, defend against floods and water infiltration using mitigation. Now, much of your water infiltration will be rainwater. And as Sally could tell you, that comes under homeowners, not under flood. And trust me, I have seen some real interesting situations in hurricane areas where everyone with all the adjusters were fighting as, well, this was water. No, this was wind. No, this was rain. It's a real pain. I would really like to see an integrated insurance system that handled all the risks to your home, but until there's more money to be made there than the way we've got it right now, it won't happen. So essentially, protect your everyday. If you see something, do something. Not just say something, do something. That's how you manage to make yourself resilient. Review flood vulnerability, either in a place that you're looking to live or where you're living. Check the area around your house for sources of flooding or perhaps weaknesses. Is there local development around that might impact runoff? Are they putting in a big development upstream of your uphill or upstream of your house? And development also includes logging or storage in the floodplain. Those are changes in how the water is going to come down the hill. I talked to a lady back in the 90s who'd been in her home for 75 years on the side of the mountain. That year, she had had 2 floods that were bad enough to force her out of her home. 75 years, same house, 1 year, 2 floods. And then check flood or erosion control structures in your area. They may be getting old. Talk to somebody, send letters to the DEC, talk to anyone you can about getting those updated. It can come back in very great profits. And if I had more time, I'd actually tell you a story about what I did in Bainbridge to help that process. So when you're reviewing, there are some keys to local flood vulnerability. What's the name of the street you're living on? Is it Lake? Is it River Street? Is it Shoreline Drive? Sometimes even the community tells you, oh, Bainbridge, think there might be a river near Bainbridge, or Baines Bridge, as it was probably originally known, Lakeland, or, well, even Cayuga, which in the original language means people of the Great Swamp. Those are just some interesting ways of figuring out, could I be at risk? Look at local vegetation. And one of the things here, this presentation is going to be out. I'm going to have a whole ton of notes, and you have no idea how many notes I've put in and links that will feed from this presentation, that you'll be able to get far more information than I'm currently giving you, and you'll be able to access brochures, booklets, a lot of different things that you can use, and it'll explain this local vegetation, because I can't take the time now to cover the ecology of wetlands. Are there depressions along your foundation? That often can be caused just over time as the sod builds up outside of your house. The areas under the eaves, the grass doesn't grow as fast, but outside it may grow really well. And that sod will actually raise the level of the ground, and suddenly you'll end up with a sag next to your foundation where the water will gather. not a good thing, because now it's going to go down along your foundation wall and probably find its way through your foundation and into your walls. Are there stains across the inside basement walls? A lot of times there will be whitish or dark stains where water has been inside a basement. Saw a lot of that in New Orleans after Katrina. Interesting thing there, they found that where the water, below the water level marks, there was no mold. Why? Well, that's because there was so much nastiness in the flood that even the mold couldn't survive afterwards. And that's just makes you wonder. I don't think I'd want to go back in those homes. So when we're talking about the I, inform yourself. Look at your local flood damage reduction ordinance, or whatever they happen to call it in your community. It tells you who the local floodplain administrator is. It gives you the official definitions. I was a contractor for 20 years, well before I got into the FEMA. And when I got there and I saw what they were talking about basements, I went, what are they talking about? And then I finally found the definition in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's like, now I understand they're using a legal term, and legality and reality do not always mix. But in this case, the legality rules. So look at those definitions. Look at your local rules. Those are key. Study local history. Make the local historian one of your friends because they can tell you about a lot of the events. Down in Owego, one of my coworkers was taken into the cellar of a very old house there, and they actually had marked in the basement the level of the 1935 flood in Owego. And that's that's another thing. There are high water marks in many communities that will show you how high that water is. If you go down through Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, they actually at one time had all the bridges marked, but they still have a river walk, and there are places on the bridges where you will see Hurricane Agnes, 1972, and here's the level, and you're looking way up over your head and you're going, oh my heavens, that was deep. So, protect your family, make a plan. In the notes for this, I've got several links to planning and how to plan for your kids. It's important and imperative that you understand what to do. Possibly make a go kit, and that's for any evacuation. If you have a fire, weather emergency, flood, what can't you afford to lose? Can you afford to lose the deed to your house, the title to your car, your prescriptions, your medications? There are so many things. Photos, family photos. One of the real tragedies of a flood is family photos go floating down the stream, although we've got digital now, which helps, but I've seen so many places where people's memories have been torn from them by the activity of a flood. There are things that you need to either find a way to put them someplace else, to store a second copy somewhere, or the object itself, if it's that valuable and that necessary, needs to be somewhere else where it's not going to be flooded. And we can always hope that it doesn't get there. How to mitigate flood risk. There are ways of doing it. In this particular picture, this is Binghamton after the remnants of Tropical Storm Lee got done. And this is, you're looking right now at the river that first bridge is going over is the Shenango, and the Susquehanna is coming down from on the right-hand side. That little white building there was in process of construction. It was a housing project for SUNY B, and the architects went to the man that was developing it after they did the first design and said, hey, right now you're quite a bit below what the new preliminary maps, which unfortunately never did go final, are showing as a flood elevation. How would you like to address that? He spent $50,000 above project cost to elevate the ground where that was placed. After that flood, the only thing that they had to do was send their people in once the streets were open and they could restart their construction. They had zero loss. That's what mitigation can do for you. Okay. There are other types of mitigation. Now here we're talking about rain, but it's damaged your home, folks. It doesn't matter whether it's flood or rain. If it's damaging your home, it's damaging your home. So, clean your gutters. Use exterior caulk to keep the rain out. Use interior caulk to prevent air leaks and issues with energy loss. It all is part of a system. That's the important thing to remember. You are living in a system, and the better that system works, the more efficiently that system works, the better your life will be, and the more resilient you and your family will be. Talking about foundations and water pooling along foundations. Standing water, never a good idea. Now you see this the picture to the right, they actually are running that rain spout all the way out. Why? Because if you dumped it right there, it'd still be pooling against the foundation and you'd still get water in your basement. Friend of mine, former coworker, actually lives down in, has a house down in the Danby area in Tompkins County. And he has had quite a bit of water coming through his basements. I went down there and I showed him how over time sod and changing of the things had caused the lawn to come up. And he had eaves troughs, but they dropped the eaves and then they paved the driveway, and that changed where that flow from the eaves trough went. And now it's going right in front of his house and sitting in front of the wall of his basement. Not a good thing, but it's an easy fix once you understand, because now you can take something like this and run that water out. Window areas. It's really nice to use window well covers to keep the rain and eaves and snow, debris. There's all kinds of things you don't want down in there. It's fairly simple to cover that and prevent that. Keeping above the water. You don't want to be trying to wander through water and deal with your utilities. She's looks like she's in a dryer, almost in a dryer. I'm not sure. That's not a good thing to be around if you're in flooding. But there are low-cost options that help to prevent that sort of thing. Putting it up on if you know you might flood that way, well, put the utilities up so that they're off the floor and not as easy to flood. Modern code has moved from the down at the baseboards all the way up to 18 inches. And that helps to keep that power out of harm's way because you don't want to be there. Berms and barriers, these are really common things. You see a great photo of someone who did one heck of a job berming their house lot there in that major river. I think that may have been the Mississippi. But the most common and the easiest for you is something like you see to the right there, where the gentleman has a panel that he can put in place during a flood to keep the water from going up against his door. You can also build them across your driveway, especially if your driveway goes down from the road, which so many places do. New York City is like the poster child for basement living. And that's why after Ida last year, we had several people, I think over a dozen people died in subgrade housing. Not good. You got to keep the water out of there. But also remember, if you've got a protection up there like this, what happens if the flood suddenly gets over top of that? All of a sudden, you've got near limitless supply to the inside. It's going to fill fast. During Hurricane Sandy, there was Father Giordano Drive is a big highway in Staten Island. People thought that would protect them. When they saw it coming over, one guy said, I saw the water coming over the road. I ran down to move my car. By the time I got there, I was up to my chest in water. There were at least 8 disabled people who died in their homes because they didn't want to take the time to evacuate. And that water caught them so fast that nobody could get them out. Now, also one little note, that permits may be required for some of what you're going to do. Now, probably not much of a permit for putting a gate in front of your door or in front of your driveway, but always check, always check. Now, electrical and mechanical opponents really don't want to go swimming. It's very bad for them, and it's not good for you either. This is a couple of pictures showing elevated utilities. You can also use a waterproof barrier around inside in a basement area to help keep the water away, so long as it doesn't go over top of it. Okay, so if your basement floods, never enter until all power has been shut off. Way too many people, in almost every flood I've been to, somebody's tried walking into a flooded basement, even to turn off the power down in the basement, and died. Not good. If the water hits any wiring, it can charge that water. And it may not be enough to kick the breakers. That's the real kicker. You may have things working. You may have lights on, and you walk into that water. If there's anything that's touching a wire someplace, you could get electrocuted. Don't do it. Let the professionals handle it. If they have to, they can pull the meter off the outside of your house. They're going to have to break the security thing and then call the utility company to come and put it back. But that's just a low price compared to your life. Don't take the chance. And I really like the picture to the right, because the lady's on her cell phone describing what's going on in her basement while she's, up to her thighs in water. And all that equipment, they all have motors. It all has electricity. The hot water heater, the furnace, they all have to have electricity in order to operate. You don't want to be there. What happens if, her power was out, she walks in there and, oh, the power company fixes it? That's a shocking development that you don't want to have to deal with. Around the perimeter of your home, flooding can saturate the soil and fill around a foundation. They almost never compact soil around a house foundation. And so it's going to be loose. It's going to suck up a lot of water. When the water gets in it, it can get very fluid, and it can put a lot of pressure on the walls. And what's the first thing almost everyone does? Volunteer fire department comes running out with a pump and sucks the water out of the inside of the basement. Don't do it. Do it in stages, a little bit at a time. Check to make sure you don't have a lot of flooding. A basement becomes a boat, effectively. It's not designed to float, but it is floating in that soil. The floor can crack. The entire building can come up out of the ground. We had a gas station over in the near Oneonta, and they forgot to fill it with sand and water when they emptied it and took it out of service. Next thing you know, the groundwater came up, and it lifted the entire corner of the building it was sitting under. So there's a lot of power. One of the things that is a mitigation system I've seen in some areas, they fill the inside of the basement with clean water. Trust me, clean water is a couple of orders of magnitude better than having flood water in your house. Flood water has the most nasty components you could ever think of. Sewage and animal waste and human waste and chemicals of all kinds. I was in one community, and I saw this retirement home. Where'd they put their hazardous waste containers? Right on the side of the channel. I'm like, man, I wouldn't want to wake up and find that in my backyard. Not a good thing to do. So it's really important to watch about it. So, as I finish up with, all of us are human. No one is perfect, certainly not me, but each of you listening can take control by using a few simple things to review, identify, inform, and defend your home or your family's homes from flood. There's other things out there, trust me, and I can talk to you about a bunch of them. I've worked on wildfires, I've worked on earthquakes, I've worked on the whole gamut of what can destroy homes. And it's possible. Not easy sometimes, but it's possible. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I will shut that down.
Thank you so much, Alan and Sally and Scott. Welcome back, everybody. We've got quite a few questions in the Q&A lined up. So Ryan, do you want to start feeding them to the panelists?
Yeah, so there were a lot. I was trying to like compile some that go together. So we'll start with a question for Alan. Do you know of any people or companies available to consult individual home or property owners to devise a flood mitigation plan?
Well, the first thing I would do is go to my local floodplain administrator and hope that they are really doing their job well. Normally, in the small communities in upstate New York, it will be someone in the building department. So if it's involving your building, they've got a pretty good handle on it. Other than that, you've got cooperative extension. You have even the DEC, who can perhaps provide some support. Companies don't know that many, and quite frankly, I'd rather not be sending anyone to anyone else simply because I don't know what they can do, and I would rather not take the chance.
There's a question that I think would probably be mostly to Scott. Is there a process for disputing parts of FEMA's map updates?
Yeah, it's a whole process that's actually outlined that's getting ready to kick off now. So in the fall, they'll come out and have this public meeting with all of us to share that information, but they have several different touch points where you can ask questions about the models that were used. You can ask questions about your particular property. You can dispute that too, and even after they take effect too. There's a whole process to show that the elevation of your house is out of that area, and if that is the case, so there's a process to do that if you'd like to do that.
Yeah, there's also the letter of map change process that once the maps go regulatory, you can apply to that. For an individual homeowner, it's free. If you're doing an area, then that is going to cost money because there's going to have to be a lot of engineering and other things done. But for individual homeowners, you can generally get a free letter of map amendment to show, oh, they're out as mapped or whatever. Because that happens sometimes. The resolution on the maps is not perfect. They are better. I mean, one of the reasons we haven't remapped in upstate New York was we were waiting for LIDAR to be done. That is now done. It was finished just a couple of years ago. So that's part of that. That's in addition to the updates. While you're doing it, yes, that's a good time because then they have to respond to all that before the maps go final.
There's a question about coverage for removal of flood debris. One attendee said, our property is bordered by a creek with recent torrential storms in 2017 and 2021. So much debris washed down the creek that the culvert got plugged, the creek jumped its bank. Our house wasn't damaged, but debris removal and landscape restoration was quite expensive. Would this type of damage be covered by the federal flood insurance policy?
No.
No, to my knowledge, no.
Nope, that only covers structures.
Right, and part I referenced the debris management plan too, which is usually those things that have some federal reimbursements on the back end are usually the full range of different debris and not typically that type of thing you described. That's more of individual landowners, sometimes municipalities that are working on that if it's a piece of infrastructure they own.
Yeah, and the one thing that they will cover other than structures is like driveways, access to ensure that a property is safe, secure, and livable, habitable.
There are so many questions. I'm trying to keep up with all of them, but we just got a question that I think would probably make a lot of sense. So it looks like their emails were being received about the mapping updates, but then those emails haven't been coming more recently. So what's the best way to stay in the loop about the process?
I do know that I talked to the FEMA Region 2 folks last week, and they just noted the fact they're working on basically the draft products right now, and so that information I'm sure will be publicly announced and publicized for whenever they do this meeting in the fall. So by no means do they have the final drafts for discussion, and that's something they're working on now. So I'm sure they'll be broadly communicated as that takes shape.
Yeah, and also there is a site that the NFIP has called the Map Service Center. You can go in there and plug in an address, and one of the things they've added is a preliminary map portion, so that when you open up all products, you can not only see historical and current maps, you can, if there's a preliminary map that's been released, as soon as that's officially released, it will be there, and they can actually look at it on that site, and it'll tell you all the information that anyone else is going to have.
And ours is not in there yet, just FYI.
No, it's not. I've looked. I've actually talked to some of the folks, and it's they have a challenge right now. They've pretty much lost all of their staff.
Yeah.
So we have a question for Sally, I believe. If someone were to change to private non-NFIP flooding insurance, would you lose your grandfathering and pay more if you return then to NFIP for flood insurance?
Yes, you do. Yeah, the minute you cancel your NFIP coverage to go to a private market, you lose the ability to come back and get that discount. If there is a break of more than 30 days, even if you non-paid, if you didn't pay your premium and there's a break of more than 30 days from the coverage, you've now lost the ability to get that discounted rate. That's why if you purchase a home that's had, for example, right now, if it's got one of these preferred risk program rates and somebody's been buying flood insurance, if they continue that policy with no break and you purchase that home, you can take over that policy and you can continue on what they call the glide path to the full rate. Right. So you're going to get there. You are going to get to the full rate, but you do get the benefits because of that 18% a year max that they can increase a year. You do get the benefits of that being discounted for, however many years it takes to get to the full rate.
I was thinking about the pre and post firm.
Yeah, no.
So another one for Sally. So there are a few questions or comments about like basements no longer being used in the rating, especially considering that utilities, furnaces, et cetera, usually are located there. So I guess could you say a little bit more about what it means for the basements to no longer be used in the NFIP rating?
So I think what they're doing is they're saying, okay, we're rating on the first floor, and we're going to then ask you the question, because when we rate one now, it specifically asks where your mechanicals are located. And so if it's sub that first floor, they're going to give you a penalty. If it's above, you're going to have the standard rate that they start with. So instead of, I would call it the way it used to rate, it rated from the basement floor or the lowest floor or your crawl space floor. Instead of rating from there, it starts at your first floor, the level that they've gotten from whatever the reports are that they've gotten them from, because I'm not quite sure where they got all of that information. It starts with the first floor, but then asks questions if these things are below the first floor. So that's how they're rating versus everything coming off, instead of asking for specific elevations of that basement. So that's just a difference in how they're using it in the rating now. That might be beneficial to some, depending on levels that they had before, but it might not be to others. It's really changing. So until we have lots more of these rated to see, we can't find a trend yet in the rating. I can't find anything in the rating as a trend to ballpark anything even.
And I think looks like Scott, maybe you're also typing an answer, but I know that there are a few questions about reading the flood maps. So questions about what the edge of the 1% hazard zone means. So I don't know if you just want to share that aloud.
Yeah, I just shared a little bit because of a lot of people asked about that in terms of, hey, what are we really talking about? I mean, what is this? How deep would this flood be here in this particular area in the zone, and what does it matter? You know, if part of my property is in this zone and not, so we don't have that depth data yet. We should be getting that when they have the official draft maps come out in the fall. But I do know that, you know, folks, big changes in terms of who's in and out. But typically when that that edge line cuts a property, it used to be, we get a lot of calls about this from banks about in terms of where that would cut in terms of if it's not a property, and Alan probably talk more detail on this too, but oftentimes when it does cut through an actual house area, in most cases, I've heard that banks have been requiring that the person carrying insurance in that case. But those edge cases, it's certainly a highlight for, hey, we need to look at this piece closer to really figure out where it relates and kind of how tall that building is. But I'm sure Alan and Sally can talk more detail on that.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the big issues, and one of the reasons they did push towards risk rating 2.0. It was possible in the old days, because that was a line that was drawn on the map, that it was like in or out, yes or no, and you could have a preferred policy even though you were virtually, you know, maybe you were 6 inches higher, but you were high enough to be outside of that regulatory zone, that you got a completely different rate and much cheaper insurance than the people right next door. Yep. And so what this is doing, because of the entire, I mean, they're going to virtually everything that the insurance and reinsurance industry is using as a basis for developing each residence's risk, so that that house now outside is going to be subject, if they're the same height, they're going to get the same rate, even though they're outside the regulatory that is used for other purposes, for floodplain management purposes and like that within the community. Sometimes you'll find it's another community, and that always was a fun thing.
I just want to interrupt that we're at 1:17, but I think we're certainly able to stay until 1:30, and we will keep recording. And I also wanted to say that since we have so many questions, I'm hoping that the panelists will agree to take a look at them afterwards for those that we didn't answer, and we can include answers to those in the follow-up email we'll be sending out to all the registrants, along with the link to this recording and the slide presentation, so you can tap into everybody's notes and Alan's resources. So, but we will have to stop at 1:30. So turn it back over to you, Ryan, for how fast can we answer some more questions?
Yep. So it looks like there are a couple of questions related to equity and environmental justice. So I'll pose both, and then I guess if anyone wants to tackle one or the other. Is putting a housing development or housing for people who have low income, people with disabilities, and the elderly, is putting that in, and it says an SFHA. Is that a form of environmental injustice? And then the second question relates to something Sally mentioned about NFIP premiums set to being more equitable. What does it mean to be more equitable in terms of ability to pay, in terms of low income or otherwise vulnerable populations having protections, or expected costs of flooding? So kind of getting at those equity injustice ideas.
I can tackle the second part of that. When they're saying that they're more equitable, it's stating that they're, as Alan had just said earlier, when two houses were right next door to each other, it wasn't fair that one house was getting a $600 rate and the other house is getting a $4,000 rate. It wasn't equitable. So what they've done is they're looking at areas, and they're looking at the specifics of the house, the replacement cost of the house, because a more expensive house is going to have a higher replacement, it's going to have more equipment that's going to get damaged, have a bigger price tag to its claim. So that's where the equitability is, it doesn't have anything to do with low income or not low income in any way on any of that I am aware of. Alan, do you?
I would agree with that. I mean, when it comes to the environmental justice issue about putting disabled or senior or other people of low income in a housing development, that's a question you might want to ask HUD, because they did it for years. They never paid attention, but now they're paying attention to the flood maps, and they're no longer putting those housing areas, I'm hoping, in those more risky areas. And but environmental justice is an executive order that they're supposed to be paying attention to. Now, do they? That's up to the management at that agency. And FEMA is not going to touch talking to another agency that much about their policies.
And I'll share my opinion on that too. I absolutely think that's an environmental justice issue because, when local governments, even when they think through their zoning of these high risk areas and, when people are allowed, I mean, it's happened throughout our history, right? People, these typically lower price properties where people are put in higher risk setups in less stable housing as well. And yeah, the actual question was, I think, absolute issue. If you are putting a known vulnerable population into a higher risk area, that's an absolute issue. Especially layer that with the complexities of the history that those folks have had to bear on top of that. I think that's an absolute issue, and I think that's something we need to definitely work hard to avoid that in our local decision making.
But it has happened, and it's a reality. I could tell you a particular town, which I won't tell you the name, where they got a property that was part of an old cleanup, environmental cleanup site, and nobody wanted to build there, and it was next to the stream. So what do? They had to take it over. So they decided that was a good place to put a retirement home. And more than once, they had, when I was there, they'd already had, fountains coming out of the stools, and to have to move elderly people in the middle of an event is
Oh, I think we lost him.
Yeah, I'm not I think you cut out a little bit. But I think we might be able to get to two more questions. This one is for Sally. Someone's asking if you can give a little clarification about how to understand the diagram or chart of discounts and rates. For example, does elevated without enclosure, so that was one of the things you included, I think in that diagram, represent a greater discount?
Elevated without enclosure would be a less discount than elevated without an enclosure will give you a better discount because water can flow freely underneath the structure. And elevated with an enclosure, if it has flood vents, would also get a better rate. Elevated with a solid enclosure is going to be different because now your walls are subject to hydrostatic pressure of water on them if in a flood, and it could collapse a wall. And it goes back to a little bit about what Alan was talking about with keeping water inside to equalize the pressure for outside, right? So, the idea behind it is to allow water to flow freely in and out of that area so that it doesn't collapse the foundation and wash your house away or collapse the house. I had a house many years ago that I insured in Waverly when it flooded, and the house became a houseboat for a while till it sunk.
And I think we might have time for just one more, but I think I might have seen a couple of questions relating to mitigation. So if a municipality that does decide to undertake some flood prevention, mitigation, or infrastructural improvements, would it, or how might it impact flood risk for the community? And also how might that impact NFIP rates if you do undertake some mitigation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a very, very timely question too, because I know there's a lot of discussion in the community about this with the updates of maps too. So the question is yes, but. So this is something I saw one of the questions example about the city of Ithaca in particular, in terms of measures that they could take that could potentially reduce rates to nearby properties if they did it. Take the example of, this is something that they're real time thinking about too. Like, how could we do this at a scale beyond just a individual property? The example of like a flood wall is an example. We see that throughout the southern tier. If you were built to build one, you need to prove that it's built to the standard that can remove properties from the floodplain. So you basically utilize the models that FEMA has done to show that, demonstrate that back to them, and then that can affect those changes. So yes, you could, in essence, if done correctly to the standards that are required, in essence, prove to FEMA that, hey, we're building this to remove properties from that flood picture. And then so the direct thing could be potentially nearby properties could be removed from the floodplain for doing that. That's typical, a very expensive process. It takes a long time to do. I know there was some discussion in the community like, well, we're thinking about these things. Could we delay the update of maps? I think the quick answer that I've heard back from FEMA is no, because these are long property and long running updates. But there is an absolute process, and Alan alluded to that too, like this process of showing, improving, and issuing like this letter of map amendment where you basically remove properties that have been in if you do a particular thing. Similar case could be on your own property too. If you did something, if you elevated your house, let's say, you could prove back to FEMA, showing what you did and showing, utilizing the models, hey, I've removed my risk such that I'm not in that risk picture anymore. It's the same thing with the community can do that at a larger scale to remove potentially multiple properties, but it's complicated.
Yes, okay. I'm thinking there probably isn't enough time for any others, but I did copy the questions that were in the Q&A to a separate document so we can send those out to our panelists.
Great. Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you once again to our panelists, and I'm sorry we lost Alan, but maybe you can watch this later on the recording and see that we so appreciated him joining us as well as everybody who was in the audience today. We had really good attendance. I really want to encourage everybody to stay engaged in this topic of reducing our flood risk. Obviously, we should all start with getting our own homes as prepared as possible, as Alan walked us through. But then, we were all talking earlier about then maybe what's the next scale up is to think about what you should be doing in terms of looking around your neighborhood and working with your neighbors to keep the storm drains clean, especially if a big storm is on its way. And also identifying where the elderly or less able neighbors who might need some help just in case it really gets dicey and they need help evacuating. But then it's also, this is, also kind of core to this Finger Lakes forecast series, is making sure that our local governments are doing all they can on our behalf, helping them do all they can on our behalf. Are they tapping into mitigation funding opportunities that are out there? Looking at the climate related new grant programs that are coming along. Are they mindful of how their zoning impacts flood risk in this new climate era? Does your planning board think about how much increased stormwater runoff is going to occur with new developments and just where that water might be headed? Who's living downstream from that overland flow? Are your highway departments doing the right kind of ditch management to slow down and spread out floodwaters? We all need to be really thinking through what are our options and what's the most strategic investments we could be making for that. I it's always the old truism, by working together, we can reduce our shared risk and make our communities more resilient. So I just want to thank the panelists again. I so appreciate having your expertise on this important topic, and thanks to the attendees. We hope you're going to join us next month on Wednesday, June 29th at noon for land use policies and practices to reduce harmful algae blooms in the Finger Lakes. We'll be providing a brief overview on what's causing the proliferation of toxic algae in our lakes. And then we're going to hear from Mandy Zepp of the Finger Lakes Land Trust and Brett Chedzoy of Schuyler Cooperative Extension on what we can do up on the land to keep the water safe. And you can register for that flood webinar at maybe you can put it in the chat, but it's bit.ly / June 29 forecast. So thanks again, and I hope we see all of you back here on June 29th. And thanks for just a really informative, good conversation today, everyone. Take care.